Hello, my name's Alex, and I'll be doing my report on the cholera vaccine. So let's get started. So here's some facts about cholera first. What is the cholera disease? It affects about 1 to 4 million people every year, and these deaths can vary anywhere from 20,000 to 140,000, and it varies for reasons we'll discuss in a little bit. But it's far-reaching. It affects about 32 countries annually, which can vary as well, and it usually happens in countries of low socioeconomic status. We compare this to its prevalence in the United States, and it only leads to about 1,000 cases every year. And if any, there's very, very rare deaths because people are wealthy enough to be able to get treatment immediately, whereas in lower socioeconomic countries, they might not have access to hospitals, even if treatment is considered inexpensive by our terms. And mainly the people getting them from the United States, getting cholera, are actually travelers who had visited these other lower socioeconomic countries. The cholera is caused by the gram-negative bacteria, V. cholerae, which settles in the gut and begins colonizing as a flagella, so this contributes to its ability to invade pretty quickly. But the bacteria itself is not harmful. It releases a toxin we call CTX, or choleragen, and this is actually what causes the massive diarrhea in cholera. It's transmitted through a fecal-oral route, and it's a waterborne disease, so humans and other shellfish who live in the water can get it. But cholera is mainly caused seasonally whenever rains come, and maybe if a country doesn't have appropriate sewage systems, then it'll wash layers of sewage out into drinkable sources, which is where outbreaks start. So there's a lot of seasonal numbers that occur with this disease. And there's about 2 main strains that we see here from serogroups, and serogroups are a group of bacteria that contain a similar antigen. The main strain we're going to talk about is serotype 01, known as the Amoeba or El Tor strain, but another common strain is 0139, known as Ogawa strain, and these 2 strains are the kind that companies are seeking to create a vaccine around because they're the most prevalent. But in recent years, it's important to know that other serogroups have been prevalent as well. Okay, so now the disease mechanism of how cholera works. Cholera releases the toxin, as I discussed, known as CTX, and CTX has 2 binding proteins, just 2 subunits. It has this A subunit, which is the blue, and then the B subunit, which is the B. And the B, it actually helps in binding to the epithelial wall of the intestine. So once it binds, it attaches to the receptor known as GM1, a ganglioside. And upon binding, the toxin is transported into the cell via endocytosis, where it binds to a G-coupled protein, shown in the red and the blue, and this will activate the adenylate cyclase enzyme, which will significantly increase the levels of CAMP. And the toxin prevents the adenylate cyclase from being turned off, so CAMP is continually being created. And the cyclic AMP activates the CAMP-dependent protein kinase, or pKa, and this pKa regulates many functions throughout the entire cell. So it activates ion channels, and it continually pumps ions into the lumen. And as it pumps out chloride ions into the intestinal lumen, the concentration increases, and water must pump out to establish an equilibrium. So this is where the associated diarrhea comes from, and basically your body will keep pumping out water until you die. So let's move on. So now symptoms and treatment of cholera. As we discussed, you have extreme diarrhea. I think you can pump out about a liter or a quart an hour. This leads to lots of dehydration, and because you're also pumping out the electrolytes into the lumen along with the water, you also have a loss in electrolytes, which can lead to lethargy or electrolyte imbalance. The stool sample in a person that has cholera is about 10 to the 11th bacteria per liter of stool sample. So this shows you how much the bacteria can grow inside the gut and really affect you. So this low electrolytes and low blood pressure leads to a lot of muscle cramps. And it could also lead to vomiting, which may last for hours and are prevalent in the first stages. The incubation period of cholera is about 10 days, so you may begin feeling symptoms then, or some people actually immediately start feeling dehydrated, and it slowly increases from there. It's important to get treatment immediately, even if it takes too long for a lab test to come back. If you feel dehydrated, or if the amount of waste that you're having is suspicious, you should probably go to the hospital immediately, because more than likely you have cholera. The main thing that they check for is if you have visited a third world country. So some treatments is they have oral rehydration. So they just give you a lot of water as they send antibiotics. Or if you're too far gone in a way, they rehydrate you via an IV. The actual treatment is an antibiotic called doxycycline. You take about 300 milligrams, even less if you're a child. So there's a cure for cholera, and you may be asking yourself, what's the problem? Like, why does cholera still exist if there's a cure? It has a very high price. I believe it's about $80, which may not seem high for getting rid of cholera, but remember that this occurs seasonally in many third world countries. And for some countries, it may be impossible to spend $80 on each citizen, or for each family, it may be impossible to afford this cure for each of your family members. So this is the main problem with cholera. It's not that we can defeat it with research and science, but it involves a lot of social, economic solutions that we're going to have to approach if we truly want to get rid of this bacteria. So now the cholera vaccine. There has been many other cholera vaccines, which I'll discuss in a little bit, but in 2016, the CDC approved its first oral vaccine known as Vaxchora. And Vaxchora is a single dose orally introduced, and it's recommended for travelers between ages 18 to 64. This is mainly in the United States. WHO has approved many other oral vaccines across different other countries, but the CDC doesn't recognize them because they're not as effective. And they're also a little bit more expensive, so many countries can't really provide the vaccine for a lot of their citizens, which we'll discuss in a little bit. But it is a live attenuated monovalent vaccine. It's lyophilized, which just means it's frozen, and it contains the strain CVD103HGR. And this is how it's effective. It reintroduces cholera into your system, but it deletes this A subunit. So we still have this B subunit, which is responsible for binding, but it cannot secrete the toxin. So as it binds to your endothelial cells, your body begins to develop an immunity for it without having water pumped out in great amounts. It does lead to slight diarrhea and slight dehydration, but nothing that you can die from. So this genomic deletion of the subunit A is what makes the vaccine effective. These are the components of the vaccine. So as I mentioned, it is designed for travelers from the United States. It must be taken 10 days before you travel to a country of low socioeconomic status. So if you believe you will get exposed in one of these areas, you must take the vaccine before leaving. This is the problem with cholera vaccine. A single dose may cost $270. And we're thinking, oh, there's a vaccine for cholera. Why is there still cases of cholera around the world? Because, as I mentioned before, the people who get cholera can't really pay for this. And not only that, it's only effective for 90 days. So if you do the math of $270 every 90 days for the rest of your life, that comes out to a lot of money. You can do the math by yourself, but just know that this is highly expensive, and if we are to go further in cholera research, there should be vaccines developed that are cheap, effective throughout your lifetime, and something that everyone is able to obtain. And as I mentioned, the side effects of this vaccine are some diarrhea, vomiting, and headaches. in about 2% of the patients who took it in the trial. And we continue with a history of cholera vaccines. So the first cholera epidemic that was actually labeled as cholera was in 1817 in India. This led to about 6 million deaths. In 1885 was the first vaccine made by James Farron, and he just introduced some of these cells into a person, and they were able to develop immunity. Here you have this poster from the 1900s, and then I'm just going to focus on this one line that says, avoid raw vegetables and unripe fruit. And also heat whenever you take certain sources of water. And this is actually a good point. Raw vegetables and unripe fruit, a lot of the times, if the bacteria can get into water supplies, especially if there's poor sanitation, which I would assume so in the 1900s. You can water your crops with the same water and the bacteria will remain on these vegetables. So it's always important to cook raw vegetables. So let's skip to the 1990s. Whole cell vaccines have been used since this time, and these include Dukoral, Sanchal, and UV-Col. And these vaccines are approved by WHO, but they're not approved by the CDC, which is so significant about Vaxchora that I mentioned before. Why are these vaccines not used widely, or why are they not approved by the CDC? They have low efficiency rates, and they are very costly. So now let's talk about some preventative measures and things we can do realistically about cholera until a much more effective vaccine is created. We have the recent Nigeria outbreak of cholera, and this is just one example. You're not going to see it on the news. There's many outbreaks across the world, but let's focus in on this one that happened about 3 weeks ago on April 6th, when it really got announced, and it led to 1,700 deaths, but I think about 16,000 people were diagnosed with cholera. This outbreak was a non-Inaba strain, which is becoming more and more prevalent, as I mentioned. And why is this outbreak significant? It led to the president declaring that open defecation is now illegal. What does this mean? So previously, defecating in the streets was legal, and now it's not, and it may seem kind of like an obvious thing to not do, but a lot of these places that get cholera outbreaks are just out in the country or in open lands, so defecation isn't quite viewed in the same way, or public defecation isn't viewed in the same way. But it leads to it seeping into the water, and this is how the seasonal burst of cholera starts. Because when the rain comes, all this poop left out in the streets will be washed away to water sources that aren't being efficiently treated. And it's not anyone's particular fault. It stems from low infrastructure costs and inability to really have appropriate water treatment. So this is actually a big step in preventing cholera, because it seems at this point finding a cure or a vaccine is too expensive. So the best thing that we can do is help some countries develop some appropriate water treatment, or even preventing cholera from being ingested in the first place. The president did this to coordinate with the United Nations Sustainable Developmental Goals, which seeks to eradicate many preventable diseases in many countries, as well as improve the quality of life there. So now we move on to preventative measures. As I said, infrastructure and water treatment are the two main things that we need to fix in order to stop the spread of cholera. And these are my sources, so thank you for listening to my presentation.